degree of catastrophe that give cause for concern. The fury of a tidal wave
is altering the planet.
The disaster the future might bring, and the next ice age.
Have you ever stopped to think about how many times the media has told you the world is ending? Well, I did some research, and in this video we'll go through 11 times some event was supposed to have a cataclysmic effect on the world and humans' place in it. What we'll find is how silly those takes look in retrospect. We'll leave it to you to apply that thinking to the crises of the future. Check out this headline. Be worried. Be very worried. That was from 2006, and worry was exactly what they wanted from you, dear Time magazine reader. Fear, terror, and your hyper-focused attention on the narrative in their magazine. 2006 is the same year Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth came out, with its portrayal of doomsday. And yet this doomsday narrative of climate change had already long been circulating. In 2004, a report from the Pentagon predicted weather patterns in Britain would begin to resemble Siberia in about 20 years. Let me do some math here. 2004, 2024, 20 years. Does Britain in any way resemble Siberia? How about pollution threatens to scorch the earth from The Guardian in 1988? Also in 1988, the Canberra Times in Australia said the Maldives Islands would be underwater by 2018. Don't worry, they're still there. Scientists predict a new ice age by the 21st century, said the Boston Globe in 1970. Also from 1970, the end of civilization feared by biochemists. A literal Nobel Prize winner, Dr. George Wald, said civilization would end within 30 years. Again, that was more than 50 years ago. He called overwhelmingly threatening the problems of pollution, nuclear war, and overpopulation. We'll get back to that last one. Stay tuned. Let me be clear, we are not climate change deniers, and we are not calling anyone a liar. But it is clear that media outlets take data and studies and run with the hottest headlines to get more attention. So there's some survivorship bias at play. Only the most apocalyptic, most exaggerated data and predictions even make the news. What do you think of that hypothesis? Let us know in the comments. When ChatGPT debuted, we were told AI will take over humanity. By the way, ChatGPT isn't really artificial intelligence. It's a large predictive language model, but I digress. The notion of runaway AI actually goes back as far as an old Kubrick film, 2001: A Space Odyssey. Remember HAL? But the real runaway in all of this is the hype train. The idea that computers can make themselves ever smarter until they achieve godlike status is just as absurd now in the time of ChatGPT as it was then. And yet Google's CEO said advances in artificial intelligence will prove more profound than the discovery of fire. A respected AI researcher has said the most likely result of building a superhumanly smart AI is that literally everyone on Earth will die. In fairness, on the other side of this debate, there are accelerationists who share some pro-liberty ideas and even use some of our imagery. See our video on the Gadsden flag to learn more about Ben Franklin's Join or Die cartoon. These accelerationists want to push AI as far and as high as it can go, and they push back against regulations on it. But much more prevalent are the AI doomers, whose breathless predictions not only look crazy, but also miss a fundamental point: that throughout history, automation has increased productivity and made life better for humans, not worse. And if you're interested in making life better for humans throughout the globe, consider Students for Liberty's local coordinator program, linked in the description. It provides young people the trainings and networks they need to become the pro-liberty leaders of tomorrow. We saw a similar doomerism with the COVID-19 pandemic. If you don't remember what the headlines looked like, especially in those first few months, we'll remind you. We must get it into our heads that our lives have changed, said this Time magazine cover with an anesthesiologist dressed to look like an invader from outer space. And no doubt, many people's lives did change in ways big and small. But here we sit, firmly back to normal by most measures. Taylor Swift sold millions of tickets on her stadium tour, and almost nobody wore masks. As it turned out, it was not the doom and gloomers who were right about COVID. It was those of us who realized this too shall pass. Hey, remember when the world was supposed to end in December 2012 because the Mayan calendar predicted the sun would align with the galactic center, subjecting us to mysterious and potentially deadly forces? A reversal of the Earth's magnetic field, bombardment by large comets and gamma rays, a dark rift in a nearby galactic spiral arm. I'll give the media a pass on this one. They must have realized we all knew this was a farce, right? Right? 2008, Great Recession. Our day of reckoning had arrived. Do you know what Day of Reckoning refers to? In Christianity and Islam, it's the last judgment of God, during which everyone is called to account for their actions in life. We were all holding on for dear life, Time magazine said. The bailout was portrayed as a bomb. Yes, people suffered. Many lost their jobs, their homes, their retirement savings. But the portrayal of the subprime mortgage crisis in this apocalyptic way was more about attracting readers and clicks than grounded in reality. Now let's go back to 2001. It was about a week after 9/11 and people were on edge already. And anthrax is gonna get us all! In reality, a total of 22 people were infected when letters containing anthrax spores were mailed to several media offices. Time magazine asks, what's next? What's next indeed? In the news industry, there always has to be something next. Their business model depends on it. As it turns out, what was coming next was the Patriot Act, as the politicians took advantage of the scares of 9/11 and anthrax to trample all over the Constitution. What's next on our countdown? Well, remember this from 1999? Y2K was the idea that computer errors when the calendar changed to the year 2000 would cripple the global economy and lead to bank failures and plane crashes. This one falls more into the category of the Mayan calendar, I think, where everyone was kinda in on the joke. Then again, Nostradamus had predicted the world would end that year, so you never know. Now granted, it had been just 13 years since this Meltdown cover in reference to the Chernobyl disaster, and only 20 years since Nuclear Nightmare. These would be funny to laugh at in retrospect if they weren't so sad. Alarmism over nuclear, driven largely by exaggerating the extent of the Chernobyl disaster and the likelihood that something like that would be repeated, has put a serious dent in the progress of nuclear energy. Politicians have used fear over nuclear power to justify regulations and restrictions, even though most reputable outlets agree nuclear is humanity's best and most efficient energy source moving forward. Of course, that fear from the 70s and 80s of nuclear power built on the fear from a decade earlier of nuclear war. The Cold War, and specifically the Cuban Missile Crisis, brought humanity to the brink of destruction, right? Kids in schools were instructed to find shelter under their desks if the alarm sounded. These were called duck and cover drills. And yeah, they really happened. Just ask your grandparents. There was acid rain, called in 1974 a serious regional environmental problem. There was The Limits to Growth, a report and book from 1972 based on a computer simulation which suggested environmental and economic collapse within a century if business as usual continued. The authors wrote a follow-up 20 years later, and this is almost too good to be true. It was called Beyond the Limits. Oh, and one more thing. Did you know that once upon a time a major concern was not global warming, but global cooling? The Ice Age cometh, The Guardian had said as far back as 1962. Now the granddaddy of them all. A lot was happening in 1968, politically and culturally, but this one tends to get forgotten. The publication of The Population Bomb by Paul Ehrlich. It predicted global famines due to overpopulation and that by the 1970s, hundreds of millions of people would starve to death. As Professor David Friedman said when we interviewed him for a previous Learn Liberty video,
that about 50 years ago, population growth had the same status in the public discussion that climate change does now. That population growth was what all of the informed expert opinions told us was going to be something between very bad and catastrophic.
And here we are, and we have the exact opposite problem. Concern over declining birth and fertility rates. Just look at what's happening to China. They've ended their authoritarian one-child policy in an effort to reverse this trend. We could go further back in time to 1956. This speculated that U.S. extraction of oil would soon peak and then start to decline. There was nothing we could do to stop it. We could go back to the War of the Worlds radio broadcast in 1938, when this was thought real by listeners. We could go back to 1912, when, according to Titanic director James Cameron, there had been such a sense of bounty. Elevators, automobiles, airplanes, wireless radio, everything seemed so wondrous. And then when news broke of the Titanic sinking, it all came crashing down, he said. We could go back to the 1800s, when light bulbs, which allowed us to see at night, were brand new, but some said would make it easier for people to be outside at night, which will result in more colds. We could go back to the roots of the population bomb scare that we mentioned. That was 1798, when Thomas Robert Malthus published this essay. We could go back further to countless proclamations from preachers and religious leaders that the end is near. The bubonic plague, the flood, Noah's Ark. We could ask, what does all this say about the human tendency to believe the world really is ending, or that it's always on the verge of a sudden dramatic change? We could ask, what role do media and politicians play in attempting to scare people, and why do they play those roles? If you're a little skeptical about whether they have the public's best interests at heart, check out Students for Liberty's network of thought leaders on ideas like public choice theory. So that's our list. Let us know in the comments if there's another world-ending menace that we left out. To me, the ultimate lesson is, somehow, some way, through all of this, humanity keeps getting wealthier, healthier, more literate, safer, and better overall, despite the constant claims to the contrary.